what's happening. So in any event, welcome to today's event, the 3 Cs Initiative, A Long Leap Forward, hosted by the Colorado European Union Center of Excellence and the Santa Fe World Affairs Forum. I'm Felicia Naranjo Martinez. I'm the Executive Director of the Colorado European Union Center of Excellence at the University of Colorado Boulder, also known as CEUCE. CEUCE aims to foster links between the United States Mountain West and the European Union by prompting mutual understanding and engagement among students, educators, researchers, policymakers, business and legal practitioners, and the general public. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. Please use the chat function to submit your questions during and after the ambassador's presentation. You may direct those questions to our moderator, Steve Kirchhoff. Note that we will keep the event open beyond our scheduled 12:15 end time to accommodate questions up until 12:30. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Pat Kushlis, President of the Santa Fe World Affairs Forum, our co-host for today's event. Pat is co-founder of the Santa Fe World Affairs Forum, which began in 2004. She is also on the Washington, D.C. based board of the Public Diplomacy Association of America. She is a former U.S. Foreign Service officer with service in Helsinki, Athens, Moscow, Manila, Bangkok, and Washington, D.C. Pat?
Thank you, Felicia. Well, it's always a pleasure and an honor to partner with CEUCE and you in particular on events that we've been holding over the past several years. The forum is a 501c3 organization, and we take an accessible, probing, multidisciplinary approach to the exploration of foreign policy, international relations, and global issues. We have a 9-member volunteer board, several of whom our members are here today, as are a number of our members and our friends. We are not affiliated nationally with any organization, but we do work in cooperation with others. Locally, CEUCE and the World Affairs Council in Albuquerque in particular. We normally hold 5 to 6 lunch programs each year and an annual spring symposium. And the spring symposium attracts close to 100 people. For the past several years, we have held events at the Santa Fe Community College. During our 2-day symposium, we explore a current critical issue of global, national, and local interest, and it is our signature event. In 2019, we focused on the challenges to democracy of rising authoritarianism. We were in the process of organizing our April 2020 symposium on climate change when COVID-19 attacked. We switched gears, began our webinars in May, and we started with Ambassador John Lang, Senior Fellow for Global Health Diplomacy at the UN Foundation. I mention this because our January 27 webinar will be an update from Ambassador Lang, and this time on global health in the midst of COVID-19 turmoil, change and progress. We currently offer our members and friends a range of international affairs programs on Zoom. And kudos and thanks to board members Krista Peterson and Steve Kirchhoff for making all of this possible. So if you're interested in learning more about Santa Fe World Affairs Forum, I invite you to visit our website, which is sfwaf.org, or email us at sfwaforum@outlook.com. And now I look forward to hearing from Estonian Ambassador Vasovi. And I'm going to turn this program back to Felicia.
Great, here we go again. It is now my honor to introduce our esteemed guest, Ambassador Jonatan Saviov. He has been serving as Estonia's ambassador to the United States since August 2018, and this is his 3rd diplomatic posting in Washington, D.C. Before assuming his current duties, Mr. Saviov worked at the Estonian Ministry of Defense for 10 years, rising to the post of permanent secretary. Until his appointment as permanent secretary in January of 2016, Mr. Saviov served as the Undersecretary for Defense Planning, the Acting Undersecretary for Defense Policy, and the Director of Policy Planning. Mr. Jonathan Saviak has completed military service and is a reserve officer. He's a graduate of the Department of Political Science at the University of Tartu and has earned a master's degree with honors in security studies from Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. He has been awarded the third class of the Order of the White Star by the President of Estonia, the first and third classes of the Cross of Merit of the Ministry of Defense, the Estonian Defense Forces Distinguished Service Decoration twice, the first class Cross of Merit of the Estonian Foreign Intelligence Service, and the Medal of Honorary Recognition by the Latvian Ministry of Defense. Welcome, Ambassador. Thank you so much for joining us today. I now turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I hope you can all hear me and see me. Please let me know if you can't. Other than that, I think we should be all set, at least that way on my screen. Thank you so much for the kind words. Thank you so much for having me. It is always a pleasure to talk to people about our region. I'm always grateful for the interest that Americans have towards not only Estonia, but transatlantic relations in general, Europe in particular, and our part of Europe especially. And I thought it would be best if I told you a little bit about Estonia before I go into the 3 Cs initiative, which is the main topic of today, obviously. You heard about my background. My background is in defense. I've been ambassador now for 2.5 years, so I think I'm more or less able to answer any questions you might have on either Estonia or the 3 Cs or Europe or transatlantic relations or the state of the world affairs as we see it. So I'm really looking forward to the questions and answers part, and I want to apologize already now for getting too carried away. If I get too carried away answering questions, please do not hesitate to stop me, otherwise we won't get to address enough of them. But anyways, a few words about Estonia. We're a small northeastern European country. A lot of people think that small countries' stories are also short. Ours is not. And it's always difficult for me to wrap the whole history of Estonia into a few minutes of discussion, but I'll do my best. And I also want to apologize for simplifying some of the aspects of our story, just in order to save time for the 3 Cs and the questions and answers. But a few things. First of all, a small country. We're 1.3 million people. One of the smallest countries in Europe. If you leave aside the city-states, then a country that would have all the normal functions of governance, from the military to its own tax system and so on and so forth. We're one of the smallest on the European continent, for sure. Not a young country. We are not pro-Western. We are the West. Have always been, always will be. Roughly lived in that part of the world for 5,000 years, I think, and have been politically organized for more than 100 now. Just celebrated a few years ago the 100th anniversary of the modern Estonian state. So, for a country that has a long history, I could start somewhere in the 13th century. I could talk a lot about the Nordic Crusades that brought Christianity to our part of Europe, but I'll skip all of that. And all I want to say about our ancient history is that we are as European and as Western as any other European or Atlantic country, if you will. And to prove my point, all I need to do is direct you to Google. If you haven't been to Tallinn, Estonia, our capital city, then Google the city, look at the pictures, look at the old town, and I can guarantee you that if I were to take you to Tallinn, old city, Tallinn, without telling you that you are in Tallinn, if I then were to tell you that you are in any one of the northern German towns that still has a medieval old town, then you would probably believe me. Because the architecture, The city itself is clearly medieval European, because that's what its history was. So the modern story of Estonia started in 1918, as Europe had torn itself apart in World War I. Major European empires had crumbled. New ideologies were all of a sudden, seemingly at least, taken over the world. There had been a revolution in Russia. Tsar had been kicked out. Germany had collapsed. Austria-Hungary had collapsed. The Brits and the French were weakened. Total chaos. And in light of that total chaos, a group of Estonian gentlemen decided that that was the moment. After hundreds of years of living under foreign rule, that now that Europe had collapsed, we had to seize our moment. They drafted our Declaration of Independence. You can access it online. It probably has an English translation somewhere. And when you read it, you'll notice that it obviously has a number of Estonia-specific things in it. It talks about the long history of Estonian people on the shores of the Baltic Sea. But when you leave the Estonia-specific things aside, then you will probably notice is that the fundamental ideas, the ideology behind the text are the exact same ideology that's behind the American Declaration of Independence. These notions that have their roots deep in European Enlightenment era philosophies, these notions of democracy and human rights and rule of law, they're the foundation of our declaration. From 1918 till 1920, we fought our war of independence against both numerous enemies, let's put it this way. We had a lot of help from our international friends, first and foremost, our close neighbors to the north, the Finns. We had volunteers who joined our war effort from Sweden, from Latvia, from Denmark, from all over Europe, but also from the United States. Remember, the United States was not engaged actively in the affairs of our part of Europe back in those days, and yet there were American volunteers participating in our war effort, several of them receiving the highest award that you could receive, the Cross of Liberty. Were they fighting for Estonia? I hope so, partially, but I think primarily they were fighting for these very same ideas and ideals, these notions of democracy and human rights, law, etc. 1920, we signed a peace treaty. Modern parliamentary democracy is truly born, and roughly 20 years later, we see clouds gathering over Europe and the world. Again, the Nazis had come to power in Germany. The Soviets had strengthened. Stalin had solidified his position. And then in 1939, to the shock of every observer in the world, the Nazis and the Soviets become allies. They sign a pact, a treaty, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after the respective foreign ministers. And in the treaty, they divide up Eastern Europe. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, eventually also Lithuania, and half of Poland are given to the Soviets, and the rest of Poland to the Germans. Poland is shortly after that partitioned. There's war. Poland loses. It's divided up. There's actually a victory parade where both the Nazis and the Soviets take part. And then we are presented with an ultimatum by the Soviets. An ultimatum to let in Soviet military bases or otherwise face war with the Soviets. It's difficult now to tell exactly what went on in the heads of our decision makers back in those difficult days, but presumably they looked around them and they saw the Nazis in the West. They saw the Soviet Union immediately on our borders, a huge military power. They saw a France and a Britain that had their hands full with the German problem and were in no position to offer us any assistance. And they saw the United States that was not engaged in European affairs. So what they decided was that perhaps they could hide Estonia from history and buy time, let the Soviets in. The Soviets made all sorts of promises, obviously, kept none of them. And once the Soviet military came in, they took over the country. The overwhelming majority of the members of the political elite, the business elite, the cultural elite, obviously the military, were killed or deported to Siberia soon after that. The country was occupied. If you happen to be 18 years old or 19 years old, and around those days, you were drafted illegally into the Soviet armed forces. When during the next year, the Germans attacked Soviets and arrived, and if you had a younger brother who became 18, 19 then, and he was drafted into the Nazi armed forces. It's not as if we managed to avoid the war. It's not as if we managed to hide ourselves from history. We fought the war in foreign uniforms and ended up losing 5 decades of our history. Ended up losing our country, ended up losing our freedom, and ended up in a situation where unspeakable crimes were committed against us and others on our soil during not only the war years, but also afterwards. So in 1991, when history changed again, the Soviet Union collapsed. We regained our independence, having protested for years before that. There were 2 lessons that I think are relevant that we took away from the 20th century that have guided our foreign policy ever since, no matter who has been in power, politically speaking, in Estonia. The 2 lessons I think are relevant today for us, for others as well. Lesson number 1, not fighting is not the safer option. You have to be ready to fight for your freedom, for your ideals, for your country. And so since 1991 on, we have invested in our defense. We have been above 2% of GDP defense spending since before President Trump came into office. It's not because we think we can do it alone. It's because we think that going quietly is the worst way to go. Lesson number 2, we should never be alone again. It's just not a good place. If you're a country of 1.3 million people, you're a small country, you don't ever want to find yourself in a position where you're literally between the rock and the hard place. So from 1991 on, our foreign policy has been one of integration into Western institutions, primarily NATO and the European Union, but also the OSCE, the OECD, the Eurozone, the Schengen area of free movement, you name it, we're a part of it. Not primarily because of economic considerations, but because of strategic considerations. In the 30 years since regaining independence, we've built up a modern economy, a truly digital country, a truly digital government. I could spend an hour discussing that alone. We do our taxes every year in usually less than 3 minutes digitally. We sign documents in a legal binding way digitally, saving us roughly 2% of GDP every year and approximately 5 days on average per person, simply because nobody ever has to go to a DMV or any other government agency to stand in a line. We even vote digitally, so that when polls close, roughly in 5 or 7 minutes, we get the overwhelming majority of the results back, making election night TV shows extremely short and boring, which obviously has its pluses as well. In any case, usually, this is the fairy tale story. A small country comes back from the brink of extinction, rises from the ashes, and builds up a modern European democracy. And I wish I could end the story here. I can't. Because as we all know, clouds are gathering again, not only over Europe, but globally. Now, when I talked about the Declaration of Independence, ours as well as yours, these notions of democracy and human rights and rule of law, then I always, when I think about that, I always also think about a saying that especially people here in the United States like to use, describing democracy as an experiment. This experiment with democracy that we have going on here. And there are 2 points that I think are relevant here for the 21st century world affairs. It is an experiment. We're constantly trying to make it better. We're constantly, it's not a perfect formula. It wasn't when we signed the Declaration in 1918. It arguably wasn't back when the United States founding fathers signed the Constitution. We're constantly trying to make it better. But I think it's also very important to recognize that there are other experiments out there, have been, continue to be. Back in the 20th century, the big competition with totalitarianism, first, the Nazis, obviously, and the communists in the Soviet Union. When those conflicts were over, that did not end history. History does not end, it never ends. And even though the challenges are different in many ways in the 21st century, it is very important for us to recognize that in light of the challenges and the challengers, we are all, as Western democracies, we are all getting, relatively speaking, smaller. So the principles that have guided Estonia's foreign policy are these two lessons: not fighting is not the safer option, and you should never find yourself alone, I think are more and more relevant for the bigger democracies out there as well. The challengers are fundamental in nature in the sense that they are truly alternative models of how a society ought to be organized. They provide fundamental alternatives to the question of the relationship between the individual and the state, economic model, even the global political model. So this is the world we find ourselves in today. And this is a perfect starting point for a discussion on the 3 Cs initiative. So what is the 3 Cs initiative? In short, if we could have the map of the 3 Cs countries on the screen. Here we go. I think it's coming up. Good. So the 3 Cs, you see the blue countries here are the European Union member states, minus obviously the United Kingdom, who has now left the European Union. The dark blue are the 3 Cs countries. 12 EU member states, all EU member states, that have joined in this initiative a few years ago, that is primarily targeted at increasing connectivity between the 12 member states themselves, but also between them and other European countries. The 3 Cs are the Baltic Sea in the north, the Black Sea in the middle, if you will, and the Adriatic Sea in the Mediterranean in the south. Most of the 3 Cs countries are in a similar situation with Estonia in the sense that they too were under the oppression of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. 3 Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were actually occupied by the Soviet Union, but the Iron Curtain divided the rest of the 3 Cs member states from normal European development as well, with the one exception of Austria. It's obviously not behind the Iron Curtain, but that's a different story. And if anybody's interested in that, I can obviously provide answers as to how come. In any case, these are the 3 Cs countries. The 2 notions that really are the foundation behind the initiative. So first of all, there is a realization that within the 3 Cs countries, there is a major infrastructure investment gap. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, had a study that came out, I think, in September of 2020, that assessed the gap to be in the roughly 100 billion, I think, euro ballpark. So a major investment gap. If we had a map here that outlined not the political boundaries of countries, but the infrastructure connections between countries, the railroads, the roads, the bridges, the pipelines, then what you would notice is that when it comes to east-west connectivity, the 3 Cs countries are in a moderately okay situation. Thanks to several years of European Union membership, major European Union investments, we have been able to connect the 3 Cs countries to the Western Europeans. However, if you were to look at north-south connectivity, then there is almost nothing. There's almost nothing. So an interesting picture would emerge. In the western part of the European Union, you would see a major crisscross of infrastructure, and in the eastern part of the European Union, you would see a lot of empty space and just connections from the east to the west. So this is point number one. There is a major investment gap. There is a major investment gap which makes no practical sense. I mean, the only reason why there is a gap is the 5 decades of lost history that most of these countries went through. Other than that, we are all members of the European Union. We enjoy freedom of movement as much between, let's say, Lithuania and Poland as between Belgium and the Netherlands. The regulations are the same. We're all in the same political club, if you will, all in the European Union. And yet we just lost 5 decades of our history, and hence has taken us time to build up all the infrastructure that our Western European friends had time to build up. So that gap needs to be filled, and it's an economic imperative. The second point that is very relevant, that actually gave rise to the 3Cs initiative, is an understanding that in the 21st century, infrastructure is no longer just an economic development issue. Infrastructure, especially big strategic infrastructure, cross-border infrastructure, has become a strategic issue. Not naming any particular countries or projects, it is clear that those that present an alternative model to world affairs and also societal affairs are currently competing with us, democracies, in the realm of infrastructure, building pipelines, ports, roads, natural gas terminals, et cetera, that are not necessarily aimed at making money in a free market environment, but aimed at increasing geopolitical leverage. So this is the strategic setting. Here we are, 12 European Union member states, most of them also members of NATO, the major Western military alliance, with a significant infrastructure investment gap. And we have competitors out there that are, in their foreign policy towards us, aiming to undermine Western institutions' unity, our cohesion, and utilizing strategic infrastructure investment for that. So it became clear that we had to compete. The problem is that our economic model, our political model, is not great at competition when it comes to these sorts of things, when limited to our public sector expenditures. The authoritarian competitor out there is always going to be more flexible, is always going to be faster when it comes to these sorts of investments, especially if these investments are carried out overseas, because they don't need to prove to parliaments or the press that the project is going to be beneficial, or that the project is going to be making money. It's easier for command economies to command money. Our strength, the strength of our economic model, is not evident in the domain of public sector. It is evident in our private sector. So a question arose, a question that is relevant for the 3Cs region, but increasingly also relevant globally. How do we compete? How do we compete? We clearly need to utilize the strengths of our private sector, but we also need to be strategic about it. We can't be just building the stuff that gives short-term benefits or profits to the companies. We need to be more strategic about it. So a few years ago, I think it was 5 or 6 years ago, the Croatian president, Polish president, initiated the 3Cs initiative, aimed at increasing connectivity between these member states by utilizing private sector capital, by utilizing the strengths of our political system. From the beginning, this initiative enjoyed strong political support from the United States. President Trump actually attended one of the presidential level meetings. The problem was that this is a hard thing to figure out. So it's relatively easy to make the argument that this is necessary. It is slightly more difficult to make it actually work. So for a few years, it took us time. We had presidential level meetings every year, summits, call them, but not much actionable stuff. was taking place. We're talking about the importance of all of this, but it was really, really hard to actually move from words to deeds. I think we've been able to fix that problem over the past 2 years, 1.5 years, and I'm very proud to say that Estonia was the chairman, if you will. We hosted the last summit during that process when we were able to move from words to deeds. And what does it mean? Well, it primarily means the following. We have set up a fund. It's called the 3 Seas Fund. The idea is to attract private sector investment into the fund to fill that 100 billion euro large investment gap in infrastructure. The fund is independent of political influence, but we as the 12 countries do provide a political framework around it that should hopefully communicate to the private sector that the investment is going to be predictable, it's going to be safe from political risk or strategic meddling. In order to attract investment, we need to market the region as a region. I opened by saying that Estonia is a small country. We're 1.3 million. I think the biggest country amongst the 3 Seas is Poland with approximately 40 million people. So big by European standards, but by global standards, relatively small still. What we need to be able to tell the private sector is that we're not an Estonia of 1.3 and a Poland of 40. We're a region within the European Union with 100 million people. That also happens to be the fastest growing part economically of the European Union, which is the preeminent global economic power. So we need to be seen as a region, not just as a group of countries. Now, people will believe you if you speak very well and show up on their screens, but they'll believe you even more if you demonstrate that you have your skin in the game. So during the past year or so, we've worked hard to attract investments into the fund by the governments concerned. 9 out of the 12 3 Seas nations have invested. We also have invited partner nations, Germany and the United States, to invest in the fund. The United States has done so. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced at last year's Munich Security Conference the United States would invest up to $1 billion. Actually, the United States in December decided to invest $300 million as a down payment, and combined we now have more than €1 billion, I think, more than €1 billion in the fund already. This is only the beginning. Clearly, the big goal is now to go and attract private sector capital. The other important thing that we've achieved is an actual investment. Actually, we have several investments that the fund has already undertaken. One actually in Estonia as a coincidence, for which I'm extremely happy. The other one, I think, in Poland. So we're off the ground. We're moving ahead. The projects are not chosen by governments. The projects are chosen by the fund. This is the free market principle here that is relevant. We as governments do provide an overall framework that guides the work of the fund. Other than that, we hope to utilize free market principles as much as we possibly can. Down the road, we believe that the 3 Seas initiative will have to grow, will grow, and the fund and its activity will grow within our region. But we also think that the model that we have invented, if you will, is relevant not only in our region, but in others as well, where similar concerns and problems are evident. Some of the fastest growing regions of the world are not in the West, but in places like, for instance, Africa, where a similar concept could plausibly be utilized to help a free market-based model compete with the alternatives that are out there. So this is the three C's. I want to underline finally a few things that the three C's initiative is not. The three C's initiative is not a security guarantee. Our security guarantee is NATO, and is membership in the European Union. The three C's initiative is not a political grouping of EU member states that aim at coordinating our policies within the European Union. It's not some kind of a subgrouping that aims to coordinate our activities in Brussels. I think over the past year and a half, 2 years, at least we in Estonia have spent considerable energy on making sure that people do not view this as some kind of an anti-Brussels grouping, if you will. This has a clear focus, a clear goal that we think is very strategic, but it has nothing to do with coordinating our policies, as I said, in Brussels. In its ideology, it is obviously a transatlantic concept, a concept that has enjoyed, as I said, strong support from the United States. But the support from the United States has never been partisan. Yes, President Trump came to one of the summits. The last summit, unfortunately, because of the COVID situation, we had to organize semi-virtually. Secretary Pompeo participated, but it is not a Republican initiative. It enjoys strong political support on the Hill in Congress by leading Democratic lawmakers. And furthermore, President-elect Biden, in his address to the Baltic Americans, or in his letter to the Baltic Americans, mentioned the three C's, and can't remember the exact quote, but basically said that he is in support of this initiative. So it is a difficult thing to tweet about. It requires more than 30 seconds of one's attention to grasp the significance of what we're trying to do here. But I think it's a truly important development and a success story with more to come. I'll conclude here. I'm really looking forward to your questions, comments, and as I said, I'm happy to discuss the three C's in more detail, or any other aspects of internet world affairs that might be of interest to you. Thank you so much.
Beautiful. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Steve. This has been an excellent and informative presentation today. Who would have guessed that we would have learned so much about Estonia and its language and the considerations thereof? Really a little icing on the cake there. Thank you, Ambassador. First and foremost, thank you, Ambassador Jonatan Saviov, Estonia's ambassador to the United States, for this enlightening presentation, not only on Estonia itself, but especially on the three C's initiative. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. We also would like to give thanks to Ms. Iti Press, Counselor for Cyber Issues and Economic Affairs at the Embassy of the Republic Estonia in Washington, D.C. Further thanks to the organizers at CEUCE and the Santa Fe World Affairs Forum, Pat Kushlis, who's the president of the Santa Fe World Affairs Forum, Steve Kirchhoff, our moderator and board member of the Santa Fe World Affairs Forum, Krista Peterson, the Santa Fe World Affairs Forum membership chair, and Shireen Miller, administrative manager for CEUCE. Thanks to you, our audience, for joining us for 3C's initiative, A Long Leap Forward. We hope that you will join us again on January 13th for our next CEUCE event, TUCL, a successful study in transatlantic university collaboration, featuring professors Don Smith from the University of Denver, Catherine Benet from the University of Oslo, and Bea Martinez Ormera from the University of Copenhagen. On this presentation, we'll bring into focus the merits of a 3-year Erasmus Network Grant Award from the EU Commission entitled Transatlantic University Collaboration on Climate Change and Energy Law. This concludes our event for today. Recordings of today's presentation can be found both at the Colorado European Union Center of Excellence at the University of Colorado Boulder and the Santa Fe World Affairs Forum websites. We look forward to your participation in our future events. And thank you so much again for joining us today. Thank you, Ambassador. I'll end the meeting now. Thanks to everyone.